Hello and welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us today for the Cloud and Kubernetes Tagging Best Practices webinar. My name is Daniela and I'll be the moderator for today's session. I'm excited to introduce Stephen, Senior Technical Account Manager, and Joel, Kubernetes Optimization Specialist here at Densify, who will lead the session and take us through the importance of optimizing your tag. And with that, I'm going to pass the mic over to Stephen to get us started.
Thank you, Daniela. Hi, everyone. Sorry I'm not on video today. I was a little under the weather, but my voice seems to be working, so we will continue. Here's just a brief agenda of what we're looking at covering today. And just to level set everybody, the first few slides go into some basic topics. First, let's start with what is a tag. A tag is a key value pair that contains metadata about one or more resources. And that key value pair consists of two objects. The first is the key, and that represents the tag name, and the value is the unique part of the resource. Here's an example in a use case. So we've got a tag name owner, that's the key, and then we've got the value, in this case it's John Doe, and when we look at it together, that gives you your resource identification. Why are tags important? Why do you want to use them? There's really two fundamental reasons. One is pure visibility, making it easy and intuitive for users to access their applications, to identify them, and then more importantly, turning content into context. You've got this data, but until you've got some kind of meaning behind it, it really can't be used, and quite frankly, nobody can care about it. So that's critical. Turning that content into context, here's an example where we've got a EC2 instance that doesn't have any specific tagging information out of the box. And then once you add some additional information, all of a sudden, now I know exactly who it belongs to, the application it's running, and the environment, and the instance type it's running on. So now I can actually do something with this information.
Yeah, looking on the left, where it's colored red, I would have, unless I was the one who did that, I have no idea what that's used for. Who does it belong to? If we're in a huge organization, it tells us nothing. But meanwhile, the organization is paying for it, right? It's something that's running, it's something that's costing us money, it's running in the cloud. And so tags really help us. It's that metadata that helps us understand what it is, what it's used for, and where we can go for more info as well.
Tag management typically falls into one of these management categories. So first is technical, and this is all about the naming of the systems using baseline naming conventions, defining the base application that a system is running, the environment it's located in, the kind of operations that your IT department would be doing with it, whether it's backups, patching, identification, whether it's part of a disaster recovery group, and whether it's part of an automation system of sorts. The second is financial, and this is all about assigning costs. So having a tag called cost center as an example is a very common one. This is used by accounting teams to assign some kind of cost identification that fits within their FinOps structure, as well as asset management too. So this is again about tracking who owns what and being able to follow its life cycle. The third would be business tags. And this would be strictly about representing a company's organizational unit structure. And this can be by department, region, project, or all of the above, as well as who owns it at a business level. So this would be your stakeholders, your executive sponsors, etc. And then there's security. So this is about using those tags to assign roles to a group of systems for a specific purpose. So it could be having IT assign management of certain systems to a group for managing and deploying their own patches and things like that, so that it's restricting only who can access it and when. We've come up with some examples of standard tags that we've seen in our experience at Densify. We've been able to kind of narrow down some of the more common ones and ones that are suggested also by FinOps Foundation. This doesn't represent all of them, but it represents some of the more common ones. Here's some brief descriptions on what each one is, and we definitely invite you to play this back so you can read more details. And then what the values look like. Here's an example for cost center. This is a tag that's used, as I mentioned before, by finance to assign a cost ID so that information can be reported back to accounting for financial purposes. And then those values will commonly have a identifier that is unique to the company and is applied uniformly across all of their configuration items. And it's not exclusive to public cloud, it also would apply to containers and to VMware and any other on-premise devices as well. Other examples that we came across in our journey were some of these tags as well, things that can be done in terms of defining whether a system belongs to a cluster, and that information can be used to define resources. Another couple of examples here, these two at the bottom, are specifically used by our Densify automation workflow to identify systems for optimization, and that information can then be fed into your CI/CD pipeline to take action and to give visibility to engineers to consider right sizing. We put together a list of best practices in governance based on our experience and what our expertise that we've built over time. And it really comes down to three key categories: people, process, and technology, none of which should be new to anybody. It really applies in this case. And on the people perspective, it's all about meeting with the key stakeholders and building a strategy plan. It needs top-down sponsorship and should always include senior members of your FinOps and your CloudOps teams. Establishing your SMART goals, so they should always be specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. And there should be some type of regular cadence set with these stakeholders, whether it's a weekly or a monthly basis. And timing can vary depending on the members and the priority of this project. The next is the process. And what we have always found, even outside of tagging, it's always best to try to build into an existing process system in your organizations are already using versus trying to create something from scratch. This includes things like establishing naming conventions, using naming conventions that will support different environments, whether it's public cloud or containers or private cloud. There can be some nuances in the naming conventions. The best advice is to keep it short and simple, not using spaces, using hyphens and underscores in place of spaces, and it'll help you be able to use these tags across all your platforms without running into issues. The other important piece is classifying which tags are mandatory and would be ones that you deem critical to your organization. And these types of mandatory tags should be applied through automation and should follow some kind of compliance during deployment or your change management process. Optional tags can be managed by your business units, and they can be basically left as placeholders so that they can manage it themselves, but they should also follow a hygiene of naming conventions. And then lastly, on the technology side, the key thing is being able to automate this process. Tagging is a very tedious process. I'm sure all of you can agree on this call. And by automating, you can avoid a lot of human error, and you can also keep the data fresh because once you've entered the data, it can become stale the next day. So there needs to be a process to keep that data ongoing and updated when organizational changes happen. The way to do this is through proactive automation. This would be initiating mandatory tags during resource creation, so at deployment times, and then during regular release cycles. The other would be reactive, and this would be tools that can detect and remediate resources that aren't following a tagging compliance. We're going to go into an example in a couple of slides. Jill is going to show us an Azure policy example. And one extreme example of using a reactive approach is to actually terminate instances if they're not compliant. We've seen customers do this in certain environments, and if engineers are not adhering to applying tags after a certain period of time, the systems are just terminated. So it's a negative way to enforce your compliance through the company, but it's sort of a last alternative, I would say.
Those three things have to work in conjunction. If you're missing any one of those, right? If you don't have the right people involved, if you don't define or stick to your process, it can evolve, but you need to have a process. And if you don't have some technology in place, it's going to fail. The technology is there just to support everything else, right? To support the compliance, making sure people are following. Technology can help with that. But if you don't have the right people or process, well, engineers or other folks, they're busy. They're busy with their time. So they might say, I don't have time to add tags to everything. Well, okay, but if exec sponsor or the CTO, CEO says, guys, you need to have this, I don't know if there's an engineer out there who might say, maybe there could be, but not many would push back against folks at that level, unless there's a really good reason, of course. So all of these things have to work in conjunction and together, and it can start small and evolve from there. In fact, we'd highly recommend that if you start developing a really complex process and a complex list of mandatory things, it's too much too quick. Change takes time. Start small. Start with one, start with two, just standardizing across the board. I can't tell you how many times I've seen different clouds, different business units, different portions of the organization. They work together, but they work kind of in their own bubble. And so they have different standards. And I think there's a slide coming up where it's going to show you what that can look like when there is no standards really in place.
We've seen certain tagging mistakes that are common throughout most organizations. These are examples of ones that should be caught and remediated when possible. The first one would be, we see it all the time where different engineers and different BUs are controlling the tags, and they'll create 4 or 5 tags that mean exactly the same thing. When it comes to trying to do something with these tags, trying to put this information into a report, nobody knows what's the correct one. Why is there 4? Why are they different names? This is where it's really critical at early stages possible to get this standardized so that everyone agrees, okay, we're going to only have one tag called application. Everybody's going to use it. It's going to follow a certain naming convention. It should be used by all teams. The other common mistake that we see, combination of different uppercase, lowercase letters. Again, depending on your reporting tools, it may not understand the differences and most likely won't understand the differences between capitalization and non. So it's best to standardize on lowercase, even on the tag name. The lowercase is always the easiest to use. If you have to use uppercase, that's fine, but we definitely recommend starting with the first letter capital, everything else lowercase. Spelling errors, this is again going back to my discussion about automation. Automation can help to avoid a lot of this. It can't avoid all of it, but by predefining your mandatory tags, you can at least solve half the problem. And then also when it comes to tags that have no value, there's no reason to put in none or NA. It just adds unnecessary information that also becomes confusing when you're reporting on your assets. And probably the strangest thing, or the most common tagging mistake to avoid, is not storing sensitive information in your tags. We have seen examples of customers where they've actually entered in things like SSH keys in their metadata, which is a big no-no. I mean, it's basically clear text password. It should not be something that's entered in metadata at all. This data should be encrypted, not kept in resource metadata that can be accessed inadvertently by other tools.
I'll get into 2 or 3 different examples of how we can use, obviously, technology to help us remediate, solve, or at least control some of these challenges. It's not going to eliminate it because there is a fine balance of how much process and how much technology and how much enforcement you want to do. There's that side of things where if you do too much, folks just, they're burdened if they have to, all they do is, bureaucratic tags, then you're losing value in actually pushing out code and pushing out apps. So there's a fine balance. But at the very least, we can use things like tools to enforce some of this compliance and enforcement. This is one example, and this is built into, and I just picked on Azure because we happen to have an example of it, but Azure has a full policy that allows you to do very customizable things, like, for example, creating a definition that you can apply across the board, across all your subscriptions, where it will catch and enforce those mandatory tags. And again, starting small. So in this case, I think we did 1 or 2 tags, and we're happy to discuss more if this is of interest. And there's so many articles as well that explain how to do this, but we're happy to point folks in the right direction. And what this means is it's built into the platform. So regardless of how the organization or the different business units, how they deploy to the cloud, because it's built in at the cloud level, doesn't matter if they use things like the built-in Azure UI and they manually create things, they're going to get those same notifications, that same control, compliance. It's enforced at the lowest level. And they'll see things like they don't configure the right tags. They'll see that error message that is defined at the policy level. The cloud resource has got to have these following tags specified, your tags. They use things like Terraform or the CLIs to deploy things. It doesn't matter because it's stopped at the cloud level. And this is a great way of doing it. And there's no extra cost if you're, in this case, using something like Azure or one of the other big CSPs. Very likely there's a way of doing it built in, or you can use a platform, a cloud management platform as well. It really doesn't matter, whatever your standard is, as long as folks have the ability to use it and you have the ability to kind of set the base level of controls. That's the important part. So let's get into a bit of an automation demo showing you what this could look like. And I'll pick on Kubernetes. My previous example was more cloud-based, but in this case, let's pick a little on Kubernetes and we'll do a live demo here and hopefully things go smoothly. But I'll show an example of what things can look like when they're not configured correctly and how easy it can be to actually get that process in place, at least at a basic level. So we've got Kubernetes. This is just a window into my little Kubernetes cluster. So I've got a few things running on it. And maybe I'll pick on Nginx, which is a web server. I've got it running in a replica set here. I've got a bunch of them running. But if I want to go in and say, well, hey, maybe this is maybe this is oversized. Maybe this is taking up a lot of cost in our cluster. Maybe this is running on 15 nodes, or in this case, 6 nodes because it's so big. Who's controlling this? What's the engineer that I can tap on their virtual shoulders and ask them to make adjustments? Well, if there's no tags, I have no idea, right? So I clicked on this. I see the app is called Nginx. The pod, we've got Nginx, so I know what it's running. I don't know who this thing belongs to. They didn't add any labels or annotations, of which we'll talk about in a little bit, but they're just a way of adding in these tags, this metadata, so that folks know what it is. If I choose another one here, like this web server, Densify web server, this is an example of what it could look like, what it should look like, and where we should have the standards. Okay, now I know what this thing is used for. What's the app? What's the project? What's the group? Who's the owner? All right, in this case, it's me. Okay, so great. But if it was somebody else, some other team in the organization, without this metadata in there, it's just impossible to get at. And it's not difficult to enforce, at least the basics. It's not difficult to get that in place. And really, once they do, it's just a matter of deploying it, right? It's just, especially with Kubernetes, but the same with cloud, it's just a bunch of text. Describe what this stuff is. So we can get that fixed up relatively quickly. If I go in here and I'll do it manually. So I've already edited the manifest, so we can go in. In fact, I'll look at it here. Yeah, so we've already added it here. So all I have to do is just run an update. In this case, a little Terraform apply. And what should happen is in the background, it'll take a few seconds here. It's always the case with live demos. It can always take a little bit longer than I would have hoped, but hopefully within a few seconds, these changes should be applied both to the deployment and the running pods as well, because it is an update. So we should see something happening here live. Hands off keyboard for a second. Yep, there it goes. All right, so change has been applied and we can see the labels are there. Now I know who owns this, who it belongs to. Now I can get into, well, maybe we do want to look at optimizing or doing something with this. If this is running on 6 nodes, 6 massive nodes, why is it over-configured? If it was, right? Just an example. I promise the focus of today is tagging, but I'd be remiss if I didn't at least mention a little bit of what Densify does. We look at optimizing both containers and clouds, and just an example of doing so, we've already analyzed these running containers. We even have the ability to say, hey, you know what? Put the recommendations in front of the engineers. We've got a nice UI where you can log in, you can validate this, but sometimes what we want is just to get it in front of them. So we've got a little easy way of adding automated annotations across all clusters where you can put the actual recommendation, those CPU and memory requests and limits in front of the engineers. They don't even need to know that Densify is running and analyzing these things. They can just say, oh yeah, okay, I can optimize, reduce my node utilization just by applying this recommendation. So that's just one nice handy way of doing that. So a couple of different ways where you can use tags, you can use annotations, labels. We'll get into some of the differences, but at a high level, Kubernetes makes it a little bit more complex. They have labels and annotations. And the main difference is labels are used for Kubernetes, annotations are used for people. or other things beyond Kubernetes. So you can think of it as that, but it's still a key value pair, works the same way. I know we've only got limited time here. If there are any other further questions, clarifications, or if you want to talk more about some of these things, happy to do so afterwards. We wanted to touch on some of the differences that we alluded to a little bit here or there, because when it comes to tagging, there are some differences in the terminologies. One of them is between AWS and Azure, two big CSPs. And if you compare GCP, Azure and AWS, they simply refer to things as tags, especially at the cloud level, at the instance level, they're tags. But GCP changes it. They kind of use a more Kubernetes approach. They rename tags to labels. But a label in GCP it's the same, it's a tag. Kubernetes, of course, changes it a little bit more. You have labels and tags. There's a few differences in the way Kubernetes labels work in their tagging structure. You can have a prefix, which kind of looks like a bit of a URL with the name, and that's kind of the standard. And that's what we would recommend. There are some advantages to that. It makes it a little bit more public and visible. None of it is enforced. It's all within the way your organization wants to do it. Of course, I mentioned annotations and labels. Labels used by Kubernetes, it uses it in matching the different controller objects, and annotations are really for people, like adding in a node or adding in maybe an integration down the line. There's many, many helpful resources. This is just a few here that I'm just putting on the screen. It's never too late to get started on your tagging journey, regardless of where you're at. You're in the middle, you're at the start, everything's done and everything's great. Then you're in maintenance mode. The important part is just to get started, making sure you get the right people involved, processes in place, and you can start getting the technology in there, because that's what's going to make this stuff really, succeed. Keeping those tags fresh, even once you have all those three things in place, things are always going to change. Organizational folks change, they evolve, they move up, they move on, and so it's important to keep that stuff meaningful, because having a tag in there that points, a non-existent group or whatnot, you really lose that context. Densify has been recognized as a market leader in the cloud resource optimization space. So we've got a GigaOM radar report, which you can feel free to download or access for more info. Lastly, Densify, we have a partnership with Intel right now called the Intel Cloud Optimizer, where Intel can help fund the Densify software. If you're interested, feel free to find out more on our website.
Thanks, Stephen and Joel, for all the great content. And this wraps up today's session. So thanks, everyone, for joining us today, and we hope to see you at the next webinar. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.